I just finished my latest book called How I Met My Mother and Other Close Encounters. It's a collection of stories, including the story of how I was reunited with my biological mother. As I finished it, I realized that it really was a wrestling with the question of who am I? It's a question that haunts almost every adoptee. Who am I really? What's the story behind the story? What's the backstory? I always assumed that if I ever was fortunate enough to encounter my biological parents, that I'd have the answer, that I would know who I am. Well, I have, and it's just gotten more complicated. I now have two stories to answer that question. I have 62 years of life with one story and 4 years of life with another story, and somehow these intervening years have been an attempt to integrate those two stories, to fit them all together into some coherent answer to that question. Who am I? It's a question that the gospel writers all wrestle with, not who I am, but rather, who is this Jesus? And who are those who are called to follow him? What does it mean to be a disciple? And perhaps the gospel that wrestles most openly with it is Mark's gospel. As a reader, we're given insights that those who follow Jesus, including the disciples, don't seem to have. We are there at his baptism. We hear the voice from heaven. This is my son, the beloved, in whom I'm well pleased. We hear the cries of the evil spirits, the unclean things. You are the Holy One of God, as they come screaming out with those exorcisms. We're given insight into who Jesus is that the others don't get. All they have is more questions. Who is this Jesus? He teaches like one with authority, not like the scribes and the Pharisees. Who is this Jesus? He casts out demons, evil spirits. Who is this Jesus? He heals the sick. He makes the lame to walk, the blind to see, the deaf to hear. He cures leprosy. He feeds the multitudes. He calms the storm. He walks on water. Who is this Jesus? Halfway through Mark's gospel, Jesus puts the question to the disciples. Who do people say that I am? Well, the response is, the polls say, majority think you're John the Baptist come back to life. Others think it's Elijah. Still others, not so sure, maybe one of the prophets. Jesus says, who do you say that I am? Peter speaks on behalf of the disciples, as he usually does. You are the Christ. You are the Messiah. And Jesus says, right you are. The only problem is that Peter and most of those who were waiting for the Messiah had it all wrong. They saw the Messiah as one who would make Israel great again, restored to the glory days of David and Solomon, bring about a religious revival in the country, make it truly Jewish again. They would restore Israel to its prominent place in the world as a world power. They would make Israel a nation with a real king, not a puppet king from Rome, but theirs. And they would boot this occupation army of Rome back to Rome. Given that expectation, Jesus was a great disappointment. He didn't do any of those things. It's no wonder Peter takes him aside after he hears about his wanting to go to Jerusalem and die. And says, Jesus, there's another way around this. We can go back to Galilee, back to the, a little seclusion. They won't look for us up there. They won't even bother us up there. We can hang out in the wilderness. Build up the militia. When we're ready, then we can take Jerusalem by storm. We can capture the capital. Jesus' response is, get behind me, Satan, because you don't get it. And then he takes Peter, James, and John up the mountain. And there he is transfigured, changed. He is presented as almost one who has come back from the dead. Something holy and mysterious. And he's joined on that mountain by Moses and Elijah. Moses being the embodiment of the Torah, and Elijah the embodiment of the prophets. Which begs the question, is Jesus the third leg of the Hebrew Scriptures, the wisdom writings? We'll get to that in a minute. The key is the voice that we heard at the baptism now booms from the clouds. This is my Son, the beloved. It's God's answer. This is who Jesus is. He is the Messiah. He is my Son. He is the beloved one. You would think that that would be enough to convince them. But in reality, they go back down the mountain and go back to the way things were. They start arguing about who's the greatest. Who's going to replace Jesus when Jesus gets himself killed? They want to know if they can get the good seats in the kingdom. They don't have a clue. Getting back to the wisdom writings, that third piece of the Hebrew Scriptures really deals with daily life. Life back down the mountain. And it wrestles with that hard question. How do I live this life, given all that I've seen? And I think what Mark is driving at, it is there that we encounter Jesus. Not on the mount, but in the midst of daily life. In fact, he drives it home at the end of his gospel, when it is the centurion at the foot of the cross that makes the great confession of faith. Truly, this is the Son of God. It is in his dying that Jesus is truly revealed. Because even the resurrection doesn't seem to quite answer the question, because the women just go running away from the tomb, afraid. We who know the answer still wrestle with how to live with this Jesus day in and day out in the midst of all the stuff that we have to deal with. but it's there that we find him. It's there in the midst of co-workers. It's there in the midst of teachers, and children, and parents. It's there in the midst of all the garbage that we deal with day in and day out, that Jesus stands with us, offering us the wisdom, the insights, the strength, the courage, the hope to persevere. Yes, it is life down the mountain where we find the answer to our question. Who is this Jesus? He's the one who dies for us and who goes with us, that we might remember who we are, the children of God, the beloved ones. And as we begin our Lenten journey in a few days, as we are marked with that ashen cross that reveals the cross that was put on our foreheads in our baptism, we are reminded of that true identity, the children of God, the beloved ones, in whom God is well pleased.